Now we'll take some questions from the audience. Students, of course, get preference from them. I'd like to just start off by asking you, I did mention briefly the conversation, which is true with Mike Bloomberg that you had. How did it really get started, and how would you contrast that right now versus the statistics I gave?
I was very fortunate when I was in London in the early 80s, just before Big Bang, to be responsible at the Journal for writing about all the government debt markets. And one of the people I called on almost every day, who was the head of government securities trading at Merrill Lynch, Mark Cutis, had a way of answering my questions with meticulous precision. Every number that he uttered, was accurate. There wasn't anything missing. And I finally went up to him and I said, "How do you get all this information? Yeah, I know you're smart, Mark, but where does it come from?" And he said, "Oh, I have this box on my desk. It's a Bloomberg." And that was my sort of coming-of-age moment of this thing that was far more insightful than anything I was capable of writing, and that was around 1984. Several years later, when I came back to New York for the Journal and I was responsible for the credit markets and securities industry, someone, unbeknownst to me, had made this decision to make Bloomberg the source of all the Treasury bond yields and prices in the Wall Street Journal, which I thought was a terrible idea because at the time all of the prices came from Merrill Lynch, and I didn't think it was a good idea for the Wall Street Journal to be running a full-page advertisement, let alone 3 for one firm. But for decades at the Federal Reserve, the process of distributing all these prices and yields to newspapers was rather cumbersome. A geriatric would come down the stairs at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, hand some legal-sized sheets of paper to another runner, and he would go up to 50 Rockefeller Center and hand them to another guy in front of a teletype machine. There'd be human error. And
remember, I said you were a young man. You're sounding like very old days.
So anyway, it was all a cumbersome process, and I was horrified that Bloomberg found himself with 3 full pages in the Wall Street Journal, and that led to nobody listened to me, by the way, and then that led later to a discussion with a colleague of mine about financial information and technology in the 80s and how that was transforming Wall Street. And since nobody ever heard of Bloomberg, we decided to make Bloomberg the focus of the piece. We wrote a front-page profile of him. The truth is, though, it took him more than a year after the piece ran to call me and suggest that he start a news business. And that's, how it began. And that was 23 years ago.
How would you say, in terms of today, the complete contrast? We said small. He just basically had a lot of technical information on prices and securities, and then how do you then build a news organization that would compete with the likes of the Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, Newswires, Telerate, and everything else?
I always said better lucky than smart, but there were a couple things that we had going for us. One is we really believed in what had already been created. That is to say, the Bloomberg was this, long before the internet was an idea to most people or an actuality. We really believed in this idea of relative value. The Bloomberg was able to give people with the most at stake instantly, at least in government securities, an idea, a very good idea of every day what was cheap and what was expensive. Relative value is a very important knowledge in everything. If you understand or you apply relative value to any category, any subject, you have a much greater understanding of where the world's headed. We figured that if we married news gathering, reporting to this data collection that Bloomberg had already started, and the computerized instant relative value analysis that it provided, we'd be creating something unique. That was our belief. And my own thinking at the time was if I could figure out a way to replicate the context and perspective of the Wall Street Journal. Back then it didn't have any pictures. It just was all words, drawings, but that's it. But what I was thinking of is convert that real time, that context and perspective to the system. The marriage of the two would be, something that was exceptional and difficult to replicate. That pretty much was the vision then, and it's pretty much the vision now, actually. It just took a lot of hard work. Mike Bloomberg is somebody who, can't work hard enough. He's still going strong, and he instilled, fortunately, that ethic in the rest of the company, and it continues to this day. And we're all paranoid. We all think, we're going to be out of business tomorrow. That's what we thought year one. It's sort of what we think today.
Yeah, there were some other questions that came in from, yes, the student over there.
You talked a little bit about academia and finance, and I thought it was really interesting because here, financial engineering is in the engineering schools. So you said that one of the things that happened in 2008 was that most inquiring minds were already co-opted by Wall Street. Do you think the financial crisis has changed that, and how do you think academia should approach Wall Street?
There was a wonderful movie that actually examined this issue. It's called Inside Job. I don't know if you've seen it. And a focus in the film was something that hadn't really been explored at all in the financial crisis. It wasn't in any of the books that had been published, all of which were bestsellers. And that was this: how did these masters of the universe get to be so important, so all-powerful? I mean, how did that happen? It didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen just because they had money. It happened because they actually were celebrated and encouraged from academia, and not just any academia, the best of academia, the Ivy League, for example. And my point about engineering is that I have a son who's an engineer, is that everything is transparent in engineering. I mean, what you're taught as an engineer is that bridge is going to, if you're any good, that bridge is going to live forever. It's going to be there forever. But it's transparent, and you can look at it every which way. The problem with finance masquerading as engineering is that you couldn't see it. You couldn't take it apart. You couldn't deconstruct it. You couldn't share the business model. You couldn't do any of these things. All of this stuff that was called financial engineering was hatched in the dark. And to me, that makes it a misnomer.
Another question? Yes.
I was just curious, going along those same lines, if you think that regulations post-2007 have gone far enough to sort of bring some of that into the light, or things like DoddFrank and other measures that have been passed, do or don't adequately address some of these issues?
It's too early to tell, and already there is a rather fierce opposition building in Congress to Dodd-Frank as it is. So it remains to be seen whether regulation will be more effective going forward. I will say, though, the two things that stand out in the unraveling of the U.S. financial system in 2008 is, one, we had institutions that were too big to fail, which is why we had to bail them out. And the failures were brought on by financial instruments that are completely opaque. Those two things are alive and well, and nothing's been done really to address them in Dodd-Frank or anything else.
I had a question. I really enjoyed your assessment of the New York Times editorial from the Goldman Sachs employee recently, and I agree with you. But the thing that I found most kind of unsettling about the whole article was the idea that Goldman Sachs is supposed to be a kind of, I guess you would say, a sales. They serve their employees, like they're like paid to serve whoever they are, whoever is investing with them, and it seemed like they totally disregarded that. And it seems like in common sense capitalism with the idea of the free hand of the market would fix anything that ignores your buyers. But because of our bailout and everything, and the idea that there's government kind of safety nets to protect these too big to fail banks, that our idea of capitalism is kind of in conflict with this, where we want kind of like the risk-taking and ingenuity of capitalism without stifling innovation, but we want also we need these safety nets because these banks are too big to fall. It's kind of like, how can we really kind of change the regulation of how these institutions work if we don't allow the market to naturally regulate itself, in the sense that the consumer will choose what benefits them?
I love your question because it really gets at, to me, it gets at the essence of what policy making should be about. And, this is such an appropriate place to consider that very question because this is, the essence of the best thinking on making policy. You need regulation actually to have the most vital, vigorous markets. You actually need, because the regulation enables open, fair competition. The conflict, if you will, with Goldman Sachs and with all these other institutions that I cited, is that they got so big and they did so many things that they were in conflict with themselves. And it was very apparent long before Mr. Smith, penned his resignation in the New York Times, that these conflicts would have terrible consequences. If Goldman Sachs on one hand is trading for itself and on the other is supposed to be representing the customer in the same market at the same time, which in fact was the case and came out in testimony before Congress, that's a conflict. There's no getting around it. Now you can say we have Chinese walls and all kinds of things, but regulation is really all about sunlight, as Brandeis said and Joe invoked earlier. It's the best disinfectant. And the problem that we have today is that the institutions in our markets are far bigger than we ever dreamed they would be. There's no way, there's no way that the CEOs of these big financial institutions have any idea what's going on in all places. They can't possibly know. And the worst of it is that the incentives in all this are all out of whack. The best markets have incentives in the right place where people are competing to provide the best service, the best goods, but that's not what happened here. An entire industry was taken over, was co-opted by its own appetite to make money. And most of the people that Mr. Smith is decrying actually are the people who have made Wall Street for the past 2 decades. And these are people who are driven by their bonuses and driven by the incentives to get ever bigger bonuses and so forth. And, that's how the system worked. And I can't really fault them because they were encouraged, as I said, by lots of people, not just in their industry. People were very excited about the fact that America's, great export was financed. Too bad it turned out to be toxic debt.
A lot has not changed. So what is the future going to be like?
I'm just a newspaper guy. The most important thing is to report so that here's hoping people will be able to appreciate what the facts are and be able to make decisions that are in their best interest. There certainly are plenty of policymakers who are dedicated to that outcome. I mean, Paul Volcker, the great Princetonian, I think is one of the more admirable people alive today, and doesn't quit on this. And there are many people who look up to him because he understands what is in the best interest. He's by no means alone, so I like to think, I'm not naive, I like to think there are plenty of people, Joe Fisher is one of them, who give a great deal of themselves to making the world better and fighting a difficult fight. I think there's a good chance things can get a lot better. This has been very traumatic. In my own experience with policymakers, whether it's central bankers or finance ministers, everybody understands how close we came to the brink. They especially understand it because they were the ones living through hell when the U.S. government was doing things that were 10 years ago unthinkable. The British government was doing things that 10 years ago were unthinkable. The German government was doing things that 10 years ago were unthinkable. That the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke has been the most inspired chairman of the Federal Reserve because he's been doing incredible things to save the U.S. from this disaster. It hasn't gotten him much popularity, sadly, because what he's doing is difficult and unfortunately misunderstood. But these are really important people and they're doing good things. So I like to think that it's not hopeless.
Yeah, one question. It's about you're talking about all these countries doing different things. When the U.S. got downgraded by S&P, one of the things we do at the university, contrast and compare. I think Bloomberg sort of reported it different than the mainstream media. Maybe you can tell us why you took a different approach, or tell people the different approaches you did take versus the mainstream on U.S. credit downgrade.
Well, look, this is a community of skeptics, and I mean that as a compliment, and a community of people who appreciate the scientific method and definitely want to verify as they go forward. In July, you recall when we had this ridiculous chicken game going on over the debt, national debt, the debt ceiling. Should have been a routine event, raising the debt ceiling. Shouldn't have been political at all. And yet, it was turned into a crisis in the month of July. And, if you were watching television, you had hysterical anchors telling you, the end was near, the U.S. was on the brink of default, and S&P was, steps away from downgrading the U.S. and so on. And it got louder and louder all through July. And, it's pretty scary because the United States economy was actually growing through June. Ben Bernanke and the Fed were pretty encouraged that we might even have a V-shaped recovery, that things were getting back to normal. But that last summer, was just so horrifying. It frightened people around the world, not just in the U.S. But there was one very interesting counter fact. There was one very telling leading indicator that said, no. Whatever you're hearing, whatever you're reading, whatever the noise, as bad as it sounds, that isn't the reality. And here's what the fact was. If you were on a Bloomberg, you didn't have to be, but if you were on a Bloomberg, and all through July, you looked at the price of a 10-year Treasury note, and a 1-year bill, and a 5-year note, you would have seen that yields did not go up. They actually went down. So that meant the confidence in the United States of America all through July was strong. In fact, getting stronger. And right up until the moment when the debt ceiling was raised, if you looked at Treasuries trading day to day, week to week, all through July, all through the summer, they were showing enormous demand because it's a supply and demand market. It's the most liquid market in the world, meaning that they're the most buyers and the sellers. And the world, which buys Treasuries, China in particular, was saying we have total confidence in the United States. In fact, we have more confidence in the United States than any other market, because if you looked at, you could do this on the Bloomberg, if you looked at the US Treasury market in July in comparison to all the other markets in Europe, in Asia, the US Treasury market outperformed all of them in the month of July. Now, you didn't read that in your local newspaper, you didn't hear that on television, nightly news didn't have it, but that was a fact. Now, what did that tell us? It said that all of this politicking, the political football, was nothing more than that, and that people in the market had no idea how this was going to be resolved, but they were convinced it was going to be resolved, because the Republicans were not going to be the first party to deliberately push the United States over the cliff. So that was the prelude. Then when S&P downgraded the U.S., similarly, there was hysteria. U.S. downgraded for the first time in its history by, who is Standard & Poor's, by the way? I mean, it's not God. But sure enough, the market that night said something else. The price of treasuries didn't go down, they went up after the downgrade. And they've been going up ever since. The price of treasuries today is higher than it was when S&P downgraded, which makes a lie of the whole ratings business to begin with. I mean, first of all, they rated Lehman Brothers AAA 2 days before it went bankrupt, and here they are downgrading the United States, and the United States debt has outperformed the world in the year 2011, and made many people rich and many people poor for betting against the U.S. So that was a big story for us, and sadly, not too many people initially grasped it. By December, though, it became apparent. Things were changing.
I think you meant to say that they rated the short-term debt highest rating, not the long-term debt, like AAA. What was, yes.
What is your take on this idea that's being floated now? What is your take on this idea that's being floated now for a financial products agency that would be similar to the FDA, the role of the
You mean what Elizabeth Warren created?
No, I think it's just two professors at the University of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
The
Yeah.
Russian Morgan Stanley.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes.
You spoke here, so.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, I've dedicated my life to translating a whole industry and subject that I think shouldn't have to be translated. Now, it's, I've done well by it, but I think this is ridiculous. We're too important a country, we're too developed to have something so fundamental and important as money in all its forms be so opaque to so many people and so one-sided, really. We really have a system that is unfair that way. So I'm all for, my goodness, we figured out how to do it with food, although we still have a ways to go, I suspect. But we do it with so many things. All kinds of products have, regulation and safety restrictions. And why shouldn't finance have the same thing? Why should people, because of their rapacious appetites, be allowed to get away with this stuff with so many innocent victims? So yeah, in theory, I'm for it.
Student here.
Your topic for today, opacity in the financial industry, seems very relevant to your role as part of the media, as a provider of sunlight. So I was wondering if you think that the news has an important role in decreasing the amount of opacity, or if this type of information that needs to be released by people on Wall Street and outsiders like those in the media aren't really able to do anything until the government forces these people to release the type of information.
Well, I guess in the simplest way, I'm with Jefferson and Franklin and believe, in a free, unfettered press. Always. I mean, that's really what characterizes the U.S. One of my extracurricular activities is the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a global thing. And we're blessed in this country, actually, because there are really important safeguards for press freedom here that really don't exist anywhere. outside the United States. And we can thank the founders, really, for that. That being the case, I also believe that we must do everything possible to cherish the press institutions that we have and to make them as robust as we can and vigorous. And obviously that's not an easy thing today in an age where spontaneous expression is hazardous because people can say anything and deliver it around the world, and they do. And misinformation and information are constantly vying with each other. And what Mark Twain said, a lie will travel halfway around the world before the truth laces up its shoes. And that certainly is the case. And that's what we're contending with. But I do believe, journalism is a very important part of ensuring that we have a healthy democracy.
And do you think that you face unique challenges because the people that you are reporting about also form a large bulk of your customers?
It's interesting. Our customers are not all the same by any means. If you looked at our customers, most of them, are obviously not American. Most of them are outside the United States. Most of them speak English as a second or third language. And their nationalities, ethnicity, race are all very different from what most people think of as the typical client of a money manager. And politically, they're also very diverse. I will say that, here's what our customers appreciate. They appreciate accurate information. They appreciate that more than anything else. What they crave is accuracy because that's what they can act on. If it isn't accurate, they can't act on it. And they want, news that is actionable because they have to make so many decisions. So accuracy above all else is what they're seeking. And that's, by the way, supposed to be what the news business is about more than anything. So, I like to think that there's a pretty good future in that. And I think that there's plenty of sponsorship and patronage for it as well.
I can say that Mayor Bloomberg last night did say that one of your concerns, I think the question was that the customers of Bloomberg would in some way influence the news division and whether he would really support you if you were writing stories that would anger people that were actually running terminals. And that was a concern of yours.
It came up many times in the past 2 decades, and every time when somebody threatened to cancel all the Bloomberg terminals, Mike Bloomberg said, "Have a nice day." And they came back.
Question over here, and then there was...
You mentioned public and private, project finance is another element where there's a lot of complexity. Could you size that, graft, corruption, waste in terms of dollar amount, and is that the next?
Actually, the expert on that is standing to my right. No one has really done more to make people in the U.S. aware of how serious the opacity in state and local government finance is than Joe Fischera. I mean, he's really been more dedicated to this subject and, ostracized by, you can guess, all kinds of very powerful constituencies. And the problem, and I've had this conversation with Joe many times, the problem is that the public doesn't understand really what I'm saying here, is that when I said earlier, JP Morgan knows more about what's going on in your town here than you do. That's not a good thing. You should know how you're borrowing money and who's doing it and whether you're getting the best rate. But from coast to coast, north to south, most citizens, sadly, have no idea how their state and local governments are financing themselves. It's completely opaque. Now, you can blame the bankers, but it's not really the bankers' fault. It's the elected officials, the appointed officials, who chose the bankers, who chose these opaque ways of doing business. And, you know, the challenge is to get people aware of this. I mean, come on, you know, when you need a fire truck, you put it up for public bid. When you need anything in a town, you put it up for public bid. Why is it when the most expensive thing in the town, which is, you know, millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars of borrowing is totally secret? That, sadly, has been totally unaddressed by national figures. And the state and local figures are, I don't understand it, I guess, much too subservient to the bankers who dine them and wine them and whatever they do with them. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs.
Question here.
You said that greed on Wall Street you thought created the 2008 crisis. But as I understand the invisible hand, it says that if everyone operates in their own self-interest, then it works out to the benefit of all. And it seems like at least half of Congress still believes that. What's your comment on that? As to why it didn't work in 2008?
Yeah. I don't believe in the tooth fairy or Santa Claus. You know, theory is wonderful. You know, and you know, obviously we can all get excited about theory, but what had happened is you had massive agglomeration of power in one place that controlled everything. Let me give you an example. You know, because this, you know, lots of congressmen say, hey, it wasn't Wall Street, it was subprime lending, it was the real estate profession. You know, it was those guys who, those brokers who sold all those houses to those people. And we encouraged them because we created policy that says we're the ownership society. You know, you heard that a lot. Well, here's what was going on. Investors around the world in the 90s, when interest rates were very low everywhere, had an enormous appetite for yield. And they couldn't get the yield from the traditional sources, government securities and even corporate securities. So the really advanced minds on Wall Street had this great idea. If we take the subprime borrower and we take his debt and we mix it in with a little treasuries and a little something else, maybe a little Fannie Mae, a little Sallie Mae, it's a little salad. And then we get the rating company to call it AAA, because when they look at the proportions of what is creditworthy and what is less creditworthy, they'll say, no, there's enough AAA in here for this to be AAA. We suddenly have to sell to the German investor, the Italian investor, the Japanese investor, the American investor, a AAA security. Now, it's created out of all this other stuff. That was the compact between the rating companies and Wall Street, and they both got rich on that basis. And what that did is it fed the subprime lending, because there was an appetite immediately for more subprime loans. So suddenly you had brokers in California, you know, selling everything they could to anybody, because that loan would be purchased immediately by somebody, by Merrill Lynch on Wall Street or Bank America or Countrywide. Somebody would purchase it. It would get put into the salad. You know, people were allergic to anchovies. They wouldn't know it because it would all get mixed up. And then it was distributed. The problem was that process was inherently corrupt, just that process. And there were plenty of people who drew attention to it. One of them was a former Fed governor, Ned Gramlich, whose last career was provost of the University of Michigan. And he went to Alan Greenspan in the 90s and he said, you know, the Fed is supposed to do something about this. This is banking and this shouldn't be happening. Now, Ned Gramlich was not a nobody. He was a very important person. He said to Alan Greenspan, we really should do something about this. It's a matter of record. And Greenspan said, no, let the market decide.
There's a cartoon that I carry around with me from the New Yorker. Shows two guys talking, and one says to the other, because there's the invisible hand of the market giving us the finger again. So, it was in the New Yorker, so I think it's accepted. I didn't say anything. Right over here, I think we have one more time for let's have this as the last question, unless lots of thank you.
Thank you. I spent most of my working career in a very large bank. It certainly was and still is a bank that was to be too big to fail. One thing we know from history is that there will be attacks on the economy, crises will occur, countries will go bankrupt or something. And it seems to me we're in a race with very important how it comes out, that if another big crisis comes along and we have the banks, are there still banks that are too big to fail? They have to build up their capital, but they haven't had time to. So if it happens soon, I worry that some big banks will not be able to survive.
I don't think there's a central banker who doesn't share your perspective or concern. As I said, I think the two biggest concerns are that there are far too many institutions that are too big to fail to this day. And they may, in the US, by the way, the US banks are perceived, many of them, to have sufficient capital. But the problem with that is that even with that capital, if they're allowed to take the kinds of risks that they were taking, that capital could prove to be insufficient. I mean, that's the whole problem. How could an institution like AIG, or for that matter, Citigroup, with all the capital it had at the time, be insolvent, essentially, at the end of 2008? And so, yeah, we have to address this. What I think is unfortunate is that if you go back to Wall Street 40 years ago, Wall Street was not made up of public companies, mostly. They were private partnerships. Now, what that meant is, because it was their money, the partners' money, they obviously were very careful about the risks that they took. And if they took bad risks, they lost their money and they went out of business. It was only when they became public, all these companies became public, then they had the opportunity to use the shareholders' money, and in the case of the banks, the depositors' money, because Glass-Steagall had evaporated by the 90s and was completely written out of history by 1998, with Citigroup becoming everything at once. And this is a real problem. I mean, the people who studied this in 1932, Glass and Steagall, they were pretty smart. I mean, they understood how we got into the Great Depression. And it's sad that, too many people don't know the history to bring it back and use it today.
All right, one last question. I actually have one last. I'll reserve the last question.
All that happened, just as you said, I know it did, happened with the blessings of the best government that money can buy. So, is there any hope that the Fourth Estate will expose the conflicts of interest and shame the present company accepted, shame the political system into addressing this internal
Well, look, it's presumptuous of me to give you the answer that you're seeking, but I can tell you from my experience, 4 years ago, we made a decision to sue the Federal Reserve. No one had ever sued the Federal Reserve, not since it was created in 1913. The idea that a news organization was going to sue the Fed was kind of laughable, and everybody thought it was ridiculous. And when we did it, the Fed thought, it was silly. But, the suit succeeded 3 times in 3 different courts at the federal level. And the result of that was the Fed is now a lot more transparent today than it ever was, before, 2008. So there's an example where you can make a difference. You can do something to change human behavior and maybe change it for the better, and maybe forever, although forever is a long time.
Yes, we need to wrap up. There are 2 things that I've talked to a lot of your reporters over time about the Bloomberg way and the way you write. Who is Aunt Agatha? And the reason I say this is that most of the reporters, Matt is a very hands-on editor and will read stories and talk about how this needs to be written for Aunt Agatha. And I was searching and trying to get whether I could get Aunt Agatha to give me a quote, but I couldn't find where she was.
Okay.
Who is Aunt Agatha in the Bloomberg way?
You know, she is the person that all of us adore, trust, confide in, and who never fails to state her opinion on anything with clarity. That's Aunt Agatha. You know, I was lucky enough early in my career to have a copy editor who was named Barbara Buckham, and they called her Mother Buckham, and she had a red pencil that, you know, those old red pencils that you sharpened by unraveling it. And, you know, my copy was always bloody after she got done with it. I've always had her in my sight because I believe that a good journalist writes a story that, if you'll forgive me, the dope can understand and the professional can appreciate. And that's really the challenge. And only someone like Aunt Agatha would insist that the story be something that a dope can understand and a professional can appreciate. There's another way of looking at it, which is, you know, if you can explain Einstein's theory of relativity, another great Princetonian, in such a way that people can understand it, then you've done what Aunt Agatha wants you to do.
Well, thank you. We have a reception. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Very well. We invite you all to a reception afterwards.